in nature there is always an understory, whereas our hills councils tell us to not grow any shrubs underneath trees. So if we're wanting a natural looking garden and we're wanting to encourage the indigenous plants, then we would have a variety of grasses and small plants, shrubs and trees. That's the way they come. So if someone is determined to have a very natural looking garden, then they carry with it a higher risk of, if a fire event happened, it would be fuelled by that understory. If it was the CFS who you were talking to, who were interested really in just stopping fires, you wouldn't have any rough barked eucalypts, you'd have only smooth bark eucalypts, you'd have all your shrubs trimmed to a high level, you'd have them only with a dense canopy. Where the lizards and the birds live, I don't know in that environment, because plants depend upon all the variety of heights and seasonality and all the rest of it. So if I was designing a native garden, then I'm left with is to be as smart as I can about where things get planted in relation to the house, and making sure I don't choose any of the really volatile species. But also trimming out dead wood from shrubs. A lot of people trim dead wood out of trees, but dead wood in trees is where microbats live. It's where bird hollows get created. So again, by protecting ourselves from fire, we're also having a negative impact on the habitat. So I would try to get at least some really tangled, prickly undergrowth far from the house, but where you can have, where lizards and blue wrens and all sorts of critters can live happily. And again, I would just try as far as possible to place them away from, not in the path, not leading up to the house. I don't mean the human path, the fire's path to the house. So on the south side of the house, you can often have a much more interesting variety of things, because that's the less vulnerable side. But keep on top of keeping things trimmed and dead branches of stuff near the house, keep it thinned out. But also some native shrubs get very leggy when they get older. So acacias, grevilleas, you might want to tip prune them from a young age. You only do it once a year, once every 2 years if you're going on a holiday instead. And that will just keep the density greater and reduce the chance that you're getting a lot of high floaty ember enhancing foliage. Doesn't matter how well watered a eucalypt is, it's still going to explode in a fire. Same with the callistemon, same with the melaleuca. It's their volatile oils. That's what make them tough, but it's also what makes them flammable. But what you say is absolutely true for a lot of oriental, introduced species, and for a lot of the Eremophila family and all of those beautiful, lush, flowering natives. They're going to be much more resilient if they're well watered. Without a doubt, drip below mulch is the most is the most efficient in terms of watering. However, you have to be conscientious about removing those blocks. Plants will get to a certain point where they don't need that. Shrubs, for example, they need a very different amount of water when they're being established than when they're established. So the Eremophilas that we've got up at the back there, they don't need water now. In fact, they're really unhappy if you give them too much. So the difficulty with a drip irrigation system is that it's not flexible for the lifespan of the plant unless you put in little individual drippers, and then you can either block them or take them out or turn them off. And I don't think I've met anybody who tells the truth about how conscientiously they go around and do that. So, that drip irrigation system is what we've used for most of the property. For the bush garden, we haven't. We've just selected plants, and through the first 2 summers, we give them deep watering, probably every 10 days, and then they're on their own. And quite a few of them die, and quite a few of them don't. Extreme fire events, the thing that people spend most of their time doing is raking up mulch and leaves and leaf litter, because they are that's the greatest fuel load, not the little shrub, but what it's left on the ground. But you can, there are sort of stages of use of mulch. When you're first establishing a garden, especially if you establish it in the early autumn, you can put a reasonable thickness of eucalypt mulch or something, shredded mulch. And as long as you plant into it a ground cover that's going to spread fairly quickly and provide a green barrier over there, then by the time your first fire season comes around, it may well not be a large problem. It won't be as much of a problem as gum tree leaves, for example. And probably the native ground covers that are the most effective, if you've got enough moisture for the local dichondra, which is they call it kidney weed. It's a very lush green sort of lawn substitute. That works really well. But there's also a very commonly used native called Myoporum, and there's a number of varieties of it, but it's a thick, spreading, sort of fairly fleshy leafed, very green ground cover, and that is something that, if you can grow that in your mulch, then you're going to have a good coverage.